Greetings, 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 greetings. It is I, your king, King Clifford Jefferson, ascended of Godfrey, the fifth caravan Jew, son of folk ruler of Jerusalem. I'm the reincarnation of King Edgar the Peaceful, which we know it here at the Third Temple English Church of England is none other than King Edgar the Peaceful, better known as the King of Peace. It is January the 16th, 2024, which is in the November year 2973. I'm here today with another marvelous lecture. This lecture is going to be tailored out off of our modern day prophet, which we call the Honorable Frederick Douglass. All right, I'm going to continue to keep a narrative of his life and to show you that he definitely was the one who sparked the match into the oversight of who he understood who he was. All right. We're going to play a small video about 10 minutes long. And what I want those who are watching this video to focus on is that the missing elements of what they're reciting in regards to the true intent of this man's life. All right. Most of those who give a reiteration of Prophet Frederick Douglass' life doesn't really expound upon his life as he states it in his book. His book, he clearly states that he is of Anglo-Saxon fraternity. He didn't say African, he didn't say Negro, he didn't say Black. He said African. I'm sorry, he didn't say African, Black, Negro, colored, or any other Muslim. He said he was of Anglo-Saxon fraternity. All right. So, in light of that, when we review what's being talked about today, keep that in mind, that none of the narratives that you're going to see today or read about focus on the grounding point of that he is of Anglo-Saxon fraternity. The reason why I say that is because we here at the Third Temple English Church of England have apparently have moved through space and time at the speed of light to catch upon the wavelengths or the consciousness of this man or this prophet, Frederick Douglass, being that this man existed in the time in the 19th century. All right. You know, we're catching up to the understanding of who he knew he was without even understanding genealogy. He knew that there was something about the Anglo-Saxon origin that he was connected to. All right. And none of the narratives in regards to Frederick Douglass' life is stating that. You know, they keep referring to us as Negroes, Blacks, slaves, etc. That was not the ideology of Frederick Douglass. He was the one who spearheaded the abolitionist movement. He was the one who spearheaded the ability for be able to persuade the emancipator Abraham Lincoln to pass the 13th to 14th Amendment. He was the one who spearheaded the argument against Chief Justice Taney on his decision on the status of those who are classified as Negro, Black, colored, and Ethiopian as a result of them not knowing who they were according to the Anglo-Saxon story that the notes to where we originated from when we were enslaved under the Norman conquest, going back to William the Conqueror, which he so eloquently speak in this article we're going to reference today. All right. So please, I'm going to continue to go over what we've been talking about, Frederick Douglass. All right. So it can get in your mind and that you get on the same frequency. Now understand that you have to be a member or part of the family of the Anglo-Saxon race. Okay. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to give honor to my queen, Sister Galveston, from the House of Galveston, as well as to all those who died as martyrs and saints for the cause. All right. Frederick Douglass. All right. So once again, I'm going to take my time. I try not to hold you long, I promise you, but we're going to draw. We're going to talk about a lot of things today. We're going to talk about the Dred Scott case dealing with uh, uh, the status of Negro black cousins in Ethiopia being classified as citizen. We're going to also talk about the uh, right of discovery doctrine that's justified by Johnson versus McIntosh. We're going to talk about the public domain or the public trust document that's qualified by case law Martin versus Waddell. We're going to also talk about acquisition of sovereignty, manifest destiny, the doctrine of discovery, the right of conquest. All this goes back to the time of the House of Tudors by Henry VII. All right. We're going to talk about the Treasons Act that was enacted for him to tell all those who were subject to his monarchship to keep quiet. All right. And this goes all the way back to the origin dealing with the union of the crowns, going back to the Crown of Scotland, which is definitely separate from the Crown of England. All right. And we're going to talk about the Slave Trade Act prohibiting the importation of slaves, which was definitely talked about uh, by Frederick Douglass because he himself was subject to the Fugitive Slave Act under Section 3, Article 4 of the Constitution of the Articles of Confederation, which is now the United States, as a result of the justification of legislation being passed for the institution of slavery, i.e., migration or intermigration, under Section 9 or Article 9 of the Constitution, of Article 1 of the Constitution. All right. So we're going to have a good time today. I'll try not to hold you long, but with all things, we want to give honor to Frederick Douglass in regards to his understanding who he was. All right. We know Frederick Douglass understand his status as a result of slave status here in North America, being that they were subject to the status of the mother, all right, which was called partusical to be a trim, all right. You had no birthright, all right. So he understood that, you know what I'm saying? He knew that his mom was a slave. His mother was Harriet Bailey. He knew she was enslaved. He knew the status that she was under as a result of her slave masters. He knew the status he was as a result of being the son of a woman who was subject to a slave master under what they call part two secretary, because we know slavery was inherently incorporated in the colonies as it was instituted and created by Great Britain, right? So we know it's Bird's family, in regards to who he was pretty much shady at the time of his understanding because he didn't know who his father was. They said he was might be his master, but in his book he said that he never considered that fact, and as a result of him doing his research, he knew that that could not be possibly true. All right, because he knew of his Anglo-Saxon fraternity, meaning he knew of the birthright primogeniture. All right, let's go into his learning. As a result of him coming to his fruition of who he was, is a result of his learning. All right, which was done by the Aud family, Sophia Aud. She taught him. All right. I want to read a quote that he stated. That's also in his book. All right. The quote you read here is actually the book from his book, From Bondage to Freedom. So when you hear the narrative from the YouTube, I'm going to show in a second, please don't keep accepting the denotations that are given them by the narratives as a colored person, a Negro, slave. This man was clearly an Anglo-Saxon descendant, and you are the same as well. And this is why he worked so hard to bring you to the light of what I'm giving you today by way of manifest that in this day and time. All right? Pay very close attention. Douglass continued secretly to teach himself to read and write. He later often said, knowledge is the pathway from slavery to freedom. As Douglass began to read newspapers, pamphlets, political materials, and books of every description, this new realm of thought led him to the question and condemned the institution of slavery. In later years, Douglass credited the Columbian orator and anthology that he discovered at the about age of 12. All right, we know in England, most of the kings right at this age, at the age of 12. So this man did all this at the age of 12, pretty much the same as his ancestors did in the days of the Anglo-Saxon kings. All right, with clarifying and defining his views on freedom and human rights. First published in 1797. All right, 1797. This is when the United States uh, uh, um, uh, central government, weak central government, is underway. All right, and he was recorder of the deeds. We know that United States couldn't have any uh, uh, land other by way of what we call acquisition of sovereignty, which is by way of what we call secession. The majority of it is how they got it. All right, and that was dependent on what we call prescription. All right, prescription. All right, which all denotes to acquisition. All right, which all denotes to acquisition. We're going to discuss these terms in a second. All right. It says that the book, and it says, first published in 1797, the book is a classroom reader containing essays, speeches, and dialogues to assist students, you're the students, and learning, reading, and grammar. He later learned that his mother had also been literate, about which he would later declare. So his mother was conscious, was able to read. All right. She wasn't illiterate. She was literate. All right. But she was literate because she knew who she was and he knew who he was based off his own words we're going to read in a second. So now you need to ask yourself, based on what we're about to read, based off his comprehension of his status, are you literate or illiterate in regards to your identity? All right? Because just because you were enslaved don't mean you were a slave. You was forced against your will. This is called forced servitude. All right? Domestic forced servitude. All right, we're going to talk about that. Frederick Douglass states that I am quite willing and even happy to attribute any love of letters I possess, and for which I have got, despite of prejudices, only too much credit, not to my admitted Anglo-Saxon fraternity. You didn't hear Negro, you didn't hear colored, you didn't hear African. So all those who claim to know Frederick Douglass, you don't know him if you're claiming he's of these terms and identities that you keep trying to associate yourself with in lieu of some type of freedom or some type of reparation, because it's not coming other by the way he set up from slavery to freedom, which is in his book. And he never said those terms which were so loosely used today. All right. It said he admitted his Anglo-Saxon fraternity, but to the negative geniuses of my sable, unprotected, and uncultivated mother, a woman who belonged to a race whose mental endowment is at present fashionable to hold in disparagement and contempt. Okay? These are from his book. Everybody should get that book, page 58. So let's go to the narrative. Remember, he was Anglo-Saxon fraternity. Okay. I'm about to play the video. We're going to play it all the way through. Pay close attention that they never use or identify him as Anglo-Saxon. They talk about his life, of course, but they never want to tell you who this man really was because they know they would be telling on themselves, which he is telling based off their true intention, which goes back to what we call the manifest destiny. Yes, the manifest destiny. All right, so let's talk about it.
This is a story of an unlikely friendship that transformed America forever. Under his wise and beneficent rule, we saw ourselves gradually lifted from the depths of slavery to the heights of liberty and manhood. Though we waited long, we saw all this and more.
See yourself in this, brothers and sisters. See yourself in this. As you can see, our elder, this man thinking into the past for the future. He think about his future. His future is based off knowing his past, but he didn't know his past. Like Frederick Douglass didn't know his past. All right. He didn't know about genealogy because the history of North America was not about genealogy. It's about fitting into that classification of free white person under the Naturalization Act, which was created by what we call positive law, which is root to slavery, as Lord Manfield said in the Dred Scott case. All right.
They told you the guys torching Wendy's in 2020 were mostly peaceful.
Abraham Lincoln is known as the Great Emancipator, but the moniker wasn't earned overnight. It would take the tireless work of the abolitionist movement, led by Frederick Douglass, who himself was born enslaved, to guide Lincoln towards the cause of freedom. I am alike familiar with the whip and chain of slavery, and the lash and sting of public neglect and scorn. And my back is marked with the one, and my soul is fettered with the other. After years of opposition, these two giants would find common ground and change the course of history. 10 years before the Emancipation Proclamation was enacted, if all earthly power were given me, I should not know what to do as to the existing institution. Oh, had I the ability, and could I reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder.
Frederick Douglass never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was about 6 or 7 years old. He would sleep head first in an old corn sack with his feet hanging out on cold winter nights to try and keep himself warm.
Teaching the enslaved to read was illegal, so young Frederick secretly traded what little food he had in exchange for reading lessons.
It just shows how much he understood how education was going to be his key to freedom.
And a key to freedom it was. At the age of 20, Douglass made a daring escape and went north, settling in Massachusetts. There he soared from orator. The one cannot be truly free, while the other is a slave. To newspaper editor. Truth is of no color. And best-selling author. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. He was the central voice of the abolitionist movement.
He had this natural gift for communication. He was eloquent. He was charismatic.
There wasn't a venue, a building large enough to hold people who wanted to hear him. Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty? That he is the rightful owner of his own body? Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed. Much of Douglass's irony was directed toward Washington, D.C. and Abraham Lincoln, the anti-slavery president who took office just as the Civil War began in 1861. Anti-slavery is very different than being an abolitionist. It was very gradual that most anti-slavery candidates believed in the abolition of slavery. I do not suppose that ultimate extinction would occur in less than 100 years at the least. That would have put the end of slavery in 1958. And for Frederick Douglass, that's outrageous. Mr. Lincoln is quite a genuine representative of American prejudice. and far more concerned for the preservation of slavery. Douglas was relentless in his fight for freedom, and with the steady drumbeat of the abolitionist movement in his ear, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing enslaved people in the southern states, and for the first time making it legal for all black men to fight in the Civil War. These new soldiers injected the Union Army with much needed manpower, but still they faced discrimination and disparity. Douglas is so outraged that he makes a trip to DC and decides he wants to meet with Lincoln himself. To his surprise, Lincoln agreed to see him immediately.
He was ushered up past all of the people that were waiting to see Lincoln that day. And just imagine this visual of this black man just bounding up the steps, and people are
Black man, Anglo-Saxon.
He gets the conversation, and he says, "Hello, Mr. Douglas," essentially. It's good finally to meet you. I've read your writings a lot. I know you've been very critical of me. Their one-on-one left a lasting impression on both men, and Lincoln vowed to improve the conditions for black soldiers.
Snap your W-2 and file your taxes 100% free with TurboTax Free Edition, roughly 37%.
My whole interview with the president was gratifying and did much to assure me that slavery would not survive the war, and that the country would survive both slavery and war. A year later, it is Lincoln who needs Douglas's help. He feels he's going to lose re-election. Essentially, he says, I need you. I think the war's going badly. Lincoln entrusted Douglas with creating a plan for aiding the escape of enslaved people from rebel territory so that they could join the Union cause. Douglas writes a detailed letter to Lincoln spelling out his vision of these special forces. He did not let me feel for a moment that there was any difference in the color of our skins. The president is a most remarkable man. With Douglas's support, Lincoln would go on to turn the tide of the war and win re-election. The following year, Douglas returned to Washington once more to attend the inauguration. Now in this multitude of elite of the land, I felt myself a man among men. This is the first time a president devotes most of the speech to African Americans.
1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves.
Frederick Douglass heard his words and his language in Lincoln's address.
Until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another, drawn with the sword.
The work that he had done over so many years was now hearing this in a very important moment in time in the nation's history.
Douglas is invited to the White House for a reception. He sees Douglas enter and yells out,
"Here comes my friend, Frederick Douglass. There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours."
Mr. Lincoln, that was a sacred effort.
Frederick Douglass spoke truth to power, and he never stopped fighting for his people, and he understood that the struggle continued. He said,
Without struggle, there is no progress. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will.
Lost in the troubles of water. All right. So as you can see, you see a narrative of Frederick Douglass' life based off the narratives who spoke on his life and his purpose and intent of how he lived his life, all right, of what he had based off what he understood that was at his disposal, all right? And the greatest thing that one can have at his disposal is knowledge of who you are based off your genealogy. Because we know this nation does not deal with that, all right? It doesn't deal with that. It deals with the immigration or migration of foreigners, colonies, all right? Colonization, all right? So this is what we're going to talk about. And we're going to hear from, once again, the prophet Frederick Douglass, all right? We're going to use this as a narrative, all right? Because he's the best example we can use because this man himself was enslaved, all right? We know that if you were a citizen, that means you were a foreigner, all right? And if you were a foreigner, then you should have had your rights protected by that government on the national standard, all right? We know that those who were classified as chattel were not protected on the national standard or a naturalized standard, for they themselves were considered chattel, property, and that identity were considered a thing, all right? You didn't have any rights. You were the thing that was being conveyed as property, all right? Whether it was international, whether it was domestic, all right? The only way this can be regulated was by institutional legislation, as Dred Scott stated, Section 9 of Article 1, and regulated by Section 3, Article 4, all right? Which we'll review in a second. But I just want to give a narrative for the purpose of secession, which for the propagation of slavery, which goes from the time going back to when we were enslaved by the Normans, as we are going to hear Frederick Douglass speak of in this article, as well as he's going to be talking about that it's very important for us to understand that the enslavement and the migration of slavery, i.e. the transporting or the conveyance of slaves, came up under what they call the fugitive slave clause, Article 3, Section 3, Article 4, all right, of the Constitution. All right, so we're going to talk about that today because it's very important, because this is what Frederick Douglass was arguing against. This is what he went to Great Britain for. This is why he became an orator. This is why he became a publisher, to bring these facts to light, all right? All right? And this is what we're doing. We're getting caught up to this frequency that Frederick Douglass was on, all right? Back in 1845, all right? So let's go to the proof. We already went through it already, but I just highlighted certain aspect of it in regards to him understanding that succession of territorial outside of that which belonged to the public domain, i.e. the crown, was used for the migration of slaves as stated in the Dred Scott case, all right? We understand that Chief Justice Taney was the judge in the Dred Scott case. He was also the judge in Martin versus Waddell dealing with the public trust or the public trust doctrine, dealing with those lands that the Confederate States had to make rules and regulations in lieu of disposition of land, respecting that which belonged to the crown. All right, it's very, very important. The only way they can take that land is by way of what we call acquisition of sovereignty. All right, the states claim to be sovereign over territory that they don't own by some type of acquisition of sovereignty, by conveying the land in lieu of you being claimed to be a sovereign by way of prescription, all right, without being contested. We talked about these terms, but we're going to bring them full circle today, all right? So let's go to this article by Frederick Douglass. We know he was an Anglo-Saxon based off paternity, right? This is the article we talked about already. The Miserable Slaves, the Degraded Serfs, Frederick Douglass, Anglo-Saxon, and the Mexican War. This denotes to the manifest destiny. All right, the manifest destiny. All right, of the new world, from the old world to the new world. Let's see how smart this man was. This is the highlighted parts. The popular myth about the American Anglo-Saxon traveling west and into the future celebrated an imbalance of power among people living out a common trajectory at different velocities. As an integrationist, Douglass wanted slaves, their owners, free blacks, and non-slave owning whites, to understand themselves as traveling along the same course, and so engage with hegemonic story about the country's destiny, despite his abhorrence of his inherent violence. Tracing this engagement exposes a thorny model. We know what thorns are, right? Of dissent, in which Douglass simultaneously calls attention to the hypercritical historical narrative of the manifest destiny, while also legitimizing the understanding of an appealing Anglo-American temporality at the core of that ideology. So he's telling you that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. He understands that the manifest destiny that was created by the new created WASP or Anglo-White Saxon Protestant was a depiction of an identity of somebody who they were trying to be, i.e., the original Anglo-Saxons who were enslaved by those Normans through the time of what we call the Middle Ages. All right. Apparently, Frederick Douglass had an understanding of all this information because these are his words. All right. Douglas' careful attention to the national story about Anglo-Saxons enabled him to understand it as a narrative through which he and other Black people living in America enter the mainstream timeline of progress. I always say, he who writes your books sets your timeline. Time never was when we as a people were not. The life become when we people don't exist. The time when we become will be no more. This is going to be explained in Johnson versus McIntosh, which deals with the right of discovery. It was assumed that the ancient people of these lands were not here in regards to the rights of those ancient people that are not here that were protected by what we call the Magna Carta. All right. It states it in Johnson versus McIntosh. All right. Douglas' careful attention to the national story about the Anglo-Saxons enabled him to understand it as a narrative through which he and other Black people living in America can enter the mainstream timeline of progress. In particular, Douglas capitalized on the notion that the genealogy had little to do with who could lay claim to the Anglo-Saxon identity. And that after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, the Anglo-Saxons were themselves enslaved. Now, we know in this book he said he was of Anglo-Saxon paternity, and he's saying right here that the Anglo-Saxon who we claim paternity of was enslaved back in 1066 by the Norman conquest who invaded England, all right? But yet he claimed that he had no notion of genealogy in regard to his understanding because at that time he was not allowed to read or write. But yet apparently he was able to get enough information to come to this conclusion that he was of Anglo-Saxon paternity, all right? And he argued that in regards to the plight of the manifest destiny that were took by those who claimed to be of Anglo-Saxon identity, but had nothing to do with genealogy because the Naturalization Act of 1790 had to deal with the status of free white person, i.e. Anglo-Saxon white Protestant. That sounds good, don't it? Okay, let's continue. So let's look at the manifest destiny. All this deals with acquisition of sovereignty. All right? Acquisition of sovereignty. Manifest Destiny was a settler colonial belief. A settler colonial belief. So the Manifest Destiny was definitely not dealing with indigenous people of that land. All right? It was dealing with those who were considered colonial settlers. And it was a belief in the 19th century that white American settlers were destined to expand across North America. It was the early expression of American imperialism in the United States of America. There you have it. That's proof for you. They ain't talking about black, because black could be considered not in lieu of genealogy, but in the classification of color. Black was not considered part of that destiny of manifestation. And we know manifest means what is evident. It's evident that what they did is right here in writing. All right? Manifest Destiny became one of the several major campaigns issued during 1844. President election, it was used by Democrats in the 1840s to justify the Mexican-American War and to negotiate the Oregon boundary dispute. Historian Franklin Mertz says Manifest Destiny always limped along because of its internal limitations, and the issue of slavery and never became the national priority of the United States. Did you hear that? So it's linked to slavery. So President Folk and O'Sullivan had a lot to do with this Manifest Destiny, all right, which Frederick Douglass is going to continue to go on about. All right. Check this out. Ironically, O'Sullivan's term became popular only after it was criticized by the Whigs opponents of the Polk administration. Whigs denounced the Manifest Destiny, arguing that the designers and supporters of schemes of conquest to be carried on by this government are engaged in treason to our Constitution and the Declaration of Rights, giving aid and comfort to the enemies of republicanism, and they are advocating and preaching the doctrine of right of conquest. Yes, right of conquest. We all heard of that. Right of conquest. It goes all the way back to the time of Henry VIII. Yes. And it was passed down to the House of Stuarts, which passed it to the Great Britain, i.e. the House of Stuart. Yes, the House of Stuart, Great Britain, those monarchs, and then incorporated, as Dred Scott said, into the colonies. All right? We see it. Let's go back to Dred Scott case. Historians remains conflicted about Polk's motive in pursuing the Mexican War. For the purpose of this article, what matters is not how or why the war happened, but why Douglass thought about these things. But what Douglass thought about these things. All right. While some current historians like Robert Murray would have us believe that slavery had little to do with Polk's aggressive expansion efforts, Douglass insists in the monarchies and freedom republics and slavery, one of his last speeches he delivered in the UK. All right. So in the speech as orator in the monarchies, freedom, republic, and slavery, one of his last speeches he delivered in the UK, that the war was a conspiracy from the beginning to end. A most deep and skillfully devised conspiracy. All right. For the purpose of holding and sustaining one of the darkest and foulest crimes ever committed by man. Douglas, 1847, 1979, 52. In other words, Douglas argued the war was fought to defend and propagate slavery. He was not alone in this position. Chattel slavery was already in place in Texas when the United States acquired it in 1846, and the admission of slave states to the Union was highly controversial between 1840 and 1850 over the course of the transition for independence. The population, no, the Viennese and ultimate failure of Wilmot Proviso, a bill drafted in 1846 by another Democrat to prevent the spread of slavery, in territories, demonstrates the clear intersection of issues surrounding the spread of the peculiar institution in Southern Democrat Pope imperialism. The relationship between the manifest destiny and its corollary Anglo-Saxonism, and slavery becomes murky in this period. Y'all hear it? It's murky in this period because you are not allowed to read, because at this time you were forced to subject to what we call forced migration through domestic slavery, right? Domestic, domestic trade. You got international trade and you got domestic trade. Domestic trade is slavery in the United States. We talk about in a second. All right. All right. So it says the relationship between manifest destiny and its corollary Anglo-Saxonism and slavery becomes murky in this period. And the Anglo-Saxonism is used not only to justify the domination of Mexicans, but also the subjugation of blacks. The Mexican-American War was largely supported by Democrats, Northern and Southerners, and opposed by Whigs. Roughly the same line along with slaveholders and anti-slavery activists fell. Whether or not the spread of slavery was at the root of the Mexican War mattered to Douglas, not only because of his deep empathy with the enslaved, but because America was actively defining itself at the same time that he was defining himself in relation to it. All right? So America is trying to define himself as a nation by way of what we call the rise of discovery, and Frederick Douglass was trying to find himself based off his birthright of an estate that was here prior to the rise of discovery, as justified in Johnson versus McIntosh, which we're talking about in a second. All right. All right. So we know the manifest destiny, which is spoken about in the Mexican-American War, was nothing more than that which was created by Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution for the United States of America, prominently called, which was at that time called Article of Confederation, and regulated by Section 3 of Article 4 of the Constitution of the United States, presently called, when they were originally under the authority of what we call the Articles of Confederation. Right? Douglas retells the story of Anglo-Saxon in America. Very important. Before we go on, you need to understand this because he understood it, right? And he was free, all right? But he was a kingmaker. If you watch my last lesson, you'll understand what kingmaker is, because you got to be careful when you're playing in the lion's den, all right? You got to be careful when you're trying to steal a bone from a dog's mouth, all right? You got to be very careful. Douglas' trip to Britain left him with the impression that America was a web of narratives constantly being retold. In his farewell to the British people, not the English people, but to the British people. You know, the British people are those who allowed those colonists to come here, all right, which were those who were practicing slavery because, as Scott said, slavery was brought over by what? Great Britain, or the Kingdom of Great Britain. And Great Britain originated from the Union of the Crowns, and the Union of the Crowns was established as a result of the right of conquest created by Henry VIII, right? By way of a secret treaty made with the Scottish king by the Treaty of Paris of 1503. We'll talk about it in a second, right? The fact is that the whole system, the entire network of America, society, is one great falsehood from beginning to end. Later in the same speech, he said, "We are a nation of inconsistencies, completely made up of inconsistencies." Given Douglas' sense of America as a composite of stories, it is unsurprising that upon his return to the United States, imbued with a new sense of agency, he would become one of the nation's most famous and controversial storytellers, the editor of the North Star. Okay? So he's narrating our story. But are you listening to the story? Are you listening to his story or somebody else's narrative of the story? Because his narrative of the story you're reading now of his Anglo-Saxon maternity, and not that of those who claim to be of Anglo-Saxon origin. The North Star, the 16th of November, 1849, we deem it settled point that the destiny of the colored man is bound up with that of the white people. Think about that. The destiny of the colored man is bound up with that of the white people of this country. We know that the destiny is the manifest destiny, which is evident based off their colonization, all right? But ours is bound up with that colonization, but we didn't colonize here. Why? Let's see why. Douglas capitalization, part 7 says that we deem it, hold on for a second. Sorry about that. All right. So he said that the colored man is bound up with that of the white people of this country, be the destiny of the latter what it may be. As it said that they're on separate trajectories. All right. Well, we're coming up, they're going down, right? Because Douglas capitalized that we're on separate trajectories as a result of the perception of our identity here as being told by Frederick Douglass. All right, it's very important. He states, and I quote, Douglas capitalizes on Anglo-Saxons to show that the true heirs to the Saxon legacy as a conquered people were not only Mexicans, as in examples above, but also black. In Douglasville, blacks had even more of a claim on Anglo-Saxon cultural heritage than Mexicans did. All right, you got the Aztecs, Mayans, but the original progenitors of the Aztecs, the Mayans, were those they call the old Mexicans. All right, the Olmec. All right, the mound builders. They built the tumulus, which is the same mound structure that were built in England or Albion. They were called tumulus, all right, which were sacred mounds buried for those who went on, all right, the martyrs and saints. It says that for Douglas, black Americans could understand Anglo-Saxon England as a point of origin by invoking medieval English history and challenging white members of his audience to think of themselves as oppressive Normans rather than Anglo-Saxon. Douglas participated in vaunting historical Saxons while he called for an end to the Anglo-Saxon sense of racial superiority. In this model, the Anglo-Saxon legacy of freedom could be more widely accessible. In American England, Christopher Hayden writes, tapping the transatlantic genealogies that had circulated through his national culture since at least 1850, Douglas assumes his white Northern audiences regard themselves as descendants of those Saxon serfs and plumbs that habit of identification for its further implication. All right? These are words from Frederick Douglass, y'all. Frederick Douglass' lecture from the 26th of January, 1848 includes references to his slave as Saxon metaphors. During the first speech, the audience was reminded that once the Anglo-Saxon race in England was subject to the Norman conquerors, though they now claimed superiority to all others and the rights to plunder and enslave them all. During the second occasion, when he reminded his Anglo-Saxon hearers that the proud Normans once trod upon the necks of their ancestors, the Saxon slaves, it was clear that the mental power of the future slave held sway over several hundred half-emancipated American Republicans. According to this report, Douglas maintained sympathy with medieval Saxons while asking 19th century American Saxons to reconsider the implications of their identification with this ancient race. All right? That needs to be reiterated. On the 16th February, 1849, the North Star republished an article called Ethnology, written by white Northern abolitionist James Russell Lowell, and originally published in Child's Anti-Slavery Standard. Lowell wrote, nations like individuals, when they have risen in a social scale, go immediately to the herald's office for a coat of arms and a pedigree. We are obliged to content ourselves with value insertion of our Anglo-Saxon descent. The truth being that the settlers of New England and those of those very, very few can lay any probable claim to such an origin. Douglas made Anglo-Saxon his property. It belonged to him just as much as anything else. Contra Lowell's perception of Anglo-Saxonism, and Smith alleges over the facts of Anglo-Saxon history, and yet, while Douglas claimed ownership of this history, he still ended this portion of his speech by alluding to the profitable comparison that might be drawn between historical Anglo-Saxon and Black American slaves. All right? These are words from Prophet Frederick Douglass, an Anglo-Saxon of Anglo-Saxon fraternity. And he was totally against secession, all right, of land that totally belonged to him, because you just said that it was his property. He understood property because he was a recorder of deeds. Yes, he was the recorder of deeds. And recorder of deeds is one who records deeds or instruments giving a non-possessory right and property to somebody who don't own it. All right? And property, he don't own it. So we got to give honor for the information that he did understand at his time of comprehension. All right? Because we know that the recorder of deeds Bear with me. Let's just go ahead. You already should know this, but I have to go over it again, just so that you can follow along with class today. Here's she, Frederick Douglass. Everybody pull it up. Recorder of Deeds or Deeds Registry is a government office tasked with maintaining public records and documents, especially recordings relating to real estate ownership that proprietary person other than the owner of the property with real rights over that property. All right. So it provides somebody other than the owner real rights over that property that they don't own. This is called acquisition of sovereignty. Everybody write this down. A number of methods of acquisition of sovereignty are or have been recognized by international law as lawful methods by which a state may acquire sovereignty or over territory. International law adopt much of the Roman property law in regards to acquisition of sovereignty due to the underlying European civil law at the time of early discovery voyages, such as the time of Christopher Columbus. The basic acquisition of states' ownership of vacant territory therefore continues to apply. And was often applied historically to land already possessed by indigenous population. He's talking about Native Americans, and this is what Johnson versus McIntosh is all about. All right, then with the rights of Native Americans under the abstract concept of time immemorial. The concrete concept of time immemorial goes back to Richard I, where the origin of time immemorial originated from. All right, so acquisition of sovereignty comes up in 5 ways: accession, succession, conquest, over time of effective occupation, all right, through prescription, as well as what they call, prescription right here, all right? So the 5 ways in lieu of acquisition of sovereignty can take place is through prescription of sovereignty, somebody acting as a sovereign for a long period of time without it being contested, all right? We already know that definition. Effective occupant, this is what we call squatting, all right? Terra nullius, all right? The modern international law of acquisition or attribution of territory generally requires that there be an intentional display of power and authority over the territory by exercise of jurisdiction in state function or continuous and peaceful basis. This is eminent domain of police powers. All right. We have conquest, right of conquest, secession, and accession. These are all dealing with acquisition of sovereignty, where a state acquire territory, assuming that it's a sovereign to for land acquisition. All right, as we gave you the five examples, but this only comes to what we call discovery. All right, because we know Johnson versus McIntosh said these lands weren't taken by what they call what they call right of conquest. It was taken by are talking about what we call right of discovery. All right. Right of conquest was created going back to Henry VIII, while the discovery was based off Henry VIII, who allowed those to come over to discover his land on his behalf. All right. So don't get it twisted. You can't play these games with the English because the English know this. All right. Very important. What is discovery of doctrine? The discovery doctrine, let me make sure you see that. We know what acquisition of sovereignty is. We know it comes up in 5 ways. All right. Accretion. What else is it, y'all? Conquest, cession, prescription, open encroachment. All right. Those are the 5. All right. That's when the state or a bunch of states jointly take interest in property that they don't own by way of prescription. Prescription of easement, which is a non-possessory use on property that you don't own. Why? Because the property that they don't own is called the public trust, which falls under what we call the public trust doctrine, as spoken in Mardell versus Walden. We talk about that in a second. The discovery doctrine or doctrine of discovery is a disputed interpretation of international law during the age of discovery introduced into the United States. Municipal law by the United States court. So that is the municipal law by the United States Supreme Court introduced into the United States by municipal law. All right. We know the municipal law is your municipality, Washington, D.C. And we know that Frederick Douglass had the problem with the policies coming out of Washington, D.C. in regards to the emancipation of the so-called Negro slaves, knowing that they was Anglo-Saxon and that they had the right to the land that they claimed that the so-called manifest destinies claimed to own by what we call right of discovery, do we call right of conquest, because the right of conquest goes back to those who gave them the right to come over here in the first place. All right? It says, the discovery doctrine or doctrine of discovery is the disputed international interpretation of an international law during the age of discovery introduced into the United States municipal law by the United States Supreme Court by Chief Justice John Marshall and Johnson versus McIntyre. And Marshall formulation of doctrine, discovery of territory previously unknown to Europeans, gave the discovery nation title to the territory against all other new European nations that came over it under what we call right of discovery, and that this title could be perfected by possession. All right. A number of legal scholars have criticized Marshall's interpretation of this relevant international law, and in recent decades, advocates for indigenous rights have campaigned against the doctrine. All right, this is what we're campaigning against. This is what Frederick Douglass was campaigning against. This is what the Anglo-Saxon was campaigning against, because we know that the land was taken by what we call right of conquest, was now they call right of discovery. All right. Let's really understand this, y'all. William Blackstone in 1756 wrote, plantation or colonies in distant countries are either such where the lands are claimed by right of occupancy only by finding them desert and uncultivated and people them from the mother country or where when already cultivated. They have been either gained by conquest or ceded to us by treaties. All right? Secession. And both these rights are founded upon the law of nature, or at least upon that of nation. All right. You got all types of nations. All right. In 1792, United States Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson claimed that the doctrine of discovery was the international law which is applicable to the new United States government as well. All right. So it was applicable to the states, is also applicable to the United States by way of their ability to gain land, as stated as under clause section 2, section 3 of Article 4. all right, by disposing of and making all rules and needful rules and regulations in regards to the territory that they claim under acquisition of sovereignty. All right, acquisition of sovereignty, because we know we're talking about the doctrine of discovery, and Johnson versus McIntosh is that case law that deals with that. All right, and Chief Justice Marshall clearly states, all right, let's read it in the case law. This is what he says. His decision. On the discovery of this immense continent, the great nations of Europe, as they were all in pursuit of nearly the same object, it was necessary in order to avoid conflict and settlements and consequent war with each other, these are these Indian tribes, to establish a principle which all should acknowledge as the law by which the right of acquisition, which they all asserted should be regulated as between themselves. This principle was that discovery gave title to the government by whose subject or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, which title might be consummated by possession. The history of America from its discovery to the present day proves, we think, the universal recognition of these principles. All right? So the principles of the right of discovery goes back to the right of discovery, going back to what we call the right of conquest, and the right of conquest, right of cession, the right of prescription, the right of accession, the right of open encroachment for a long period of time, all denotes to acquisition of sovereignty. Can we all agree? All right, let's continue. Right of conquest. You heard this term a couple of times already. The right of conquest is the right of ownership to land after immediately possession via force of arms. Did you hear that, y'all? Via force of arms. Very important to understand that, because we understand that the force of arms that was committed by the United States was done by way of what we call succession. All right? Succession to propagate slavery, as echoed by Prophet Frederick Douglass, from the Mexican and American War all the way back to the time of the colonies allowing themselves to come over here by way of colonization, all right, or settlers, all right. And in order for you to do that, you must have some type of instrument allowing you to come, all right, allowing you to come, and that's based off the right of discovery. You know what I'm saying? But the right of discovery succeeded right of conquest. All right. The right of discovery was preceded right of conquest. Right of conquest was the right of ownership of land after immediate possession via force and arms. And we know at this time the right of conquest took place at the time of what we call the War of the Roses. All right. The War of the Roses between the cadet branch of the Yorks and the Lancasters, which were cadet branches of Plantagenet crown established by Godfrey V Caliban. All right. We understand that these are facts. All right. Let's qualify this. Henry VIII. The reign. To secure his hold on the throne, Henry declared himself king by right of conquest retroactively by the 21st of August, 1485, the day before the Bosworth War or conflict. Thus, anyone who fought for Richard against him would be guilty of treason, and Henry could legally confiscate the land and property of Richard III. Richard III was of the House of York. Henry VIII was of the House of Lancaster, the cadet branch that was both established by, what's his name? Couchback. I forgot his name. John Couchback. Henry Couchback. I forgot his name. Don't quote me on that. All right. But it says that Henry spared Richard's nephew and designated heir John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, and made the Yorkist heirs Marcus Plantagenet, Countess of Salisbury, Sejour. He took care not to address the baronage or summon Parliament until after his coronation, but took place in Westminster Abbey on the 30th of October, 1485. This is called the Treaty of Treason Act of 1495. Let's do that. The Treason Act of 1495, which preceded the right of conquest of the House of Plantagenet and Lancaster branch by the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, all right, which gave birth to the Union of the Crowns. The Treaty of Act of 1495, formerly referred to the Act of Henry VII, is an Act of Parliament of England which was passed in the reign of Henry VII of England. After the defeat of Richard III in the Battle of Bosworth on the 22nd of August 1485, Henry VII was crowned King of England. However, Henry VII backdated the start of his reign on the 21st of August, the day before the battle, which enabled him to prosecute anyone who fought under the revival and execute them for treason. This was a highly controversial since he meant that anyone who fought for the rightful king against the usurper, i.e. him, would be at risk of execution if they lost and might undermine their courage and loyalty. Nevertheless, Henry VII had his way as the Parliament of England was in no position to oppose him, although later that year a general pardon was issued to those who had fought for Richard III. All right, let's go back to what we call Henry VIII. We know Henry VIII conquered England by way of right of conquest. And right of conquest gave right of discovery because most of those who came by way of right of discovery was done by way of Henry VIII. All right, so let's get into the history of the Union of the Crown, because that gives us a prehistory of how the right of conquest and the right of discovery got underway. All right, Union of the Crowns. All right, August 1503, James VI, fifth of Scotland, married Margaret, eldest daughter of Henry VII of England. In the spirit of the new age was celebrated by the post-William Dunbar and the Thistle and the Rose. All right. The marriage was an outcome of the Treaty of Perpetual Peace. All right, we heard about that. The King James of what was it? Fourth, the fifth, and Henry VII. All right. The marriage was the outcome of the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, concluded that the previous year, which in theory ended centuries of Anglo-Scottish war. The marriage brought Scotland's Stuarts into England's Tudor line of succession. So the House of Stuart, i.e. the monarchs of the House of Stuart, i.e. the Scottish kings, became unified with the House of Tudors through the Tudor line of succession through what we call the Union of the Crowns, through the Thistle and the Rose. All right. So what is the Thistle and the Rose? Let's read that. This is an old poem, y'all. The Thistle and the Rose is a Scott poem composed by William Dunbar to mark the wedding in August 1503 of King James IV of Scotland and Prince Margaret Tudor of England. All right. Historical context. The marriage of James IV, King of Scots, and Margaret Tudor, the eldest daughter of Henry VII of England, had been agreed in the Treaty of Perpetual Peace in 1502. The treaty was intended to effect a reconciliation between the Kingdom of Scotland and England, which had been at war intermittently since 1296. This treaty of peace or friendship between King James III, who took the side of the Lancaster instead of the House of York. All right, let's see. The Treaty of Perpetual Peace was signed by James IV of Scotland and Henry VII of England in 1502. It agreed to end the intermediate war between Scotland and England, which has been waged over the previous 200 years, and although it failed in this respect, as hostilities continued intermittently throughout the 16th century, it led to the unions of the crown. All right, that's what we're talking about now. A rose-colored red and white had been adopted as a dynastic symbol by Henry VII, who seized the throne of England in 1485 by right of conquest. Everybody see that, right? By right of conquest, all right? It says Henry VIII seized the throne of England by right of conquest, all right? And it said he adopted as a dynastic symbol by Henry VII, who seized the throne of England in 1485. It represents the union of the Lancaster and Yorkish fascists of the Plantagenet dynasty, who have fought a series of civil wars called the War of the Roses for control of the English throne, i.e. the crown, i.e. corporations, so over crown land. And we know crown land is intel, and we know that the king represents or personified or incarnates crown land because it's inseparable. That's why it's called the statute of mortemain, dead pledge. All right, and we know that all those wanted to sit in that English throne or the crown or corporation so as a natural person, but none of them had the right to do so because of this primogeniture birthright, which was practiced by the Plantagenet crown through what we call agnatic succession. All right, agnatic succession. You must understand that. All right. The Lancaster and the Yorkist cadet branches fought over the succession of the Plantagenet dynasty created by Godfrey the Fifth Count of Anjou, where my family name Jefferson is sent down from. Okay? Very, very, very important to understand what's going on because Frederick Douglass opened the door for you. All right? I just played that video for you. All right? Look at how many of our ancestors suffered of ignorance as a result of him not knowing, you not knowing your paternal birthright going back to your father. All right, you understand it from your mother because that's all you know. But in under Part 2 Secretary, that was a state of servitude. You were born in the slavery. You couldn't have no property. You didn't have no right of suffrage. You didn't have no type of due process whatsoever, whether you were bond or free. We're going to validate it because that's the reason why we see Frederick Douglass had a problem with Dred Scott case delivered by Chief Justice Taney as a result of them or how he tried to classify us Anglo-Saxons as now Negro, black, colored, and Ethiopian. That is the problem, y'all. It is the very problem, and the result of the interregnum and of your return of your estate as a result of the continued demise of our the English throne by de facto king, because somebody got to sit there. Somebody has to sit in that seat. All right, either going to be God or either going to be the devil. All right, let's continue. So we know that the union of the crowns was a result of the Treaty of Perpetual Peace between Henry VII and King James IV. All right, of the House of Scotland. All right, which gave birth to King James VI through the what we call the treaty of what was the 1603. I forgot what act that was, but we'll get to it later. For the sake of time, I got a lot to cover, so let's move forward. All right. So we must understand the union of the crowns, and the union of the crowns is the crowns of England, Ireland, and Scotland. England got his crown. We know the crown is corporated so it's a natural person. All right. And if you understand the concept of crown, then you don't have a problem understanding the concept of the Scottish crown because they got their own person sitting there as well. All right. So what is the Scottish crown? All right. The Crown of Scotland. The Crown of Scotland is the centerpiece of the House of Scotland. It is the crown that was used at the coronation of the miners of Scotland and is the oldest surviving crown in the British Isles and among the oldest in Europe. One of the oldest, all right? The crown must have been made during the reign of Robert the Bruce of his son David II, and David was anointed and crowned, as were all the subsequent Stuart kings, all right? It was probably this new crown that was modeled into a current crown, remade in its current form by James V, all right, successor of James IV, the one who made the treaty with King Henry VII and the Treaty of Perpetual Peace of 1502. King James V in 1540, the crown was last used in the coronation of Crown Charles II at the restoration of that king in 1651. Until 1707, the crown was presented at the opening of each term of the Parliament of Scotland as a symbol of royal authority. The crown has been present at each opening ceremony at the Scottish Parliament since 1999. Let's get into the origin and history of it, all right? Let's get into the origin and history of it. The earliest known depiction of the Scottish monarchs wearing a crown is from the reign of Edgar, and his name is Edgar Macmill, all right, King of Scotland, all right, not King Edgar the Peaceful, all right, don't get it twisted. All right, the first written reference to the crown of Scotland dates from the application of John Balliol in 1296. We know that in 1295, Scottish got their independence from who? Edward I, and we can find Edward I in statues in New Jersey. All right. Yes, New Jersey's legislative statutes are the parliamentary statutes of the kings of the Plantagenet cadet branches of the Yorks and the Lancasters, because we know in New Jersey by statute, the entail estate was abolished. All right. Now they became indefeasible. All right. And we know title insurances, which are these that everyone have in their pockets, are instruments that are not indefeasible. They're defeasible. Why? Because it cannot, the chain of title could not be traced back to the original grantor. Why? Because the original grantor is always and is going to be the crown. All right? No one deals with that. All right? But they deal with it in Johnson versus McIntosh. They deal with it in Martin versus Waddell. They deal with it in Dred Scott versus Sanford. All right? They deal with it in these cases. We're going to talk about them in a second. All right? But we need to understand that when you're dealing with those who wrote your books, and I always say, he who writes your book, just your timeline, all this goes back to the wars who took place on this continent, which we call North America. Because we know that Spain and France succeeded all their territory, i.e. cession to Great Britain in the Treaty of Paris of 1763. All right? All that goes back to what we call the public trust doctrine. Let's see. Let's make sure. I'm not gonna lose my place, y'all. Royal Proclamation right there. Royal Proclamation of 1763, the Treaty of Paris. All right? So you got to know what you're talking about, y'all. You got to know what you're talking about. All right? We're talking about discovery doctrine, and this discovery doctrine preceded the right of conquest, and the right of conquest was based off Henry VII invaded or claimed himself to be King of England through the supremacy as a result of the Supremacy Act of 1534. We know that Henry VII was of the cadet branch of the Lancaster branch. All right, so he had no right to claim himself as King of England. When you just a cadet branch of the Angevia branch, which is nothing more than the cadet branch of the Plantagenet crown. You had no rights whatsoever, right? Because the origin of the crown of Scotland was seized by who? Edward I. All right, let's go back to it. The earliest known depiction of the Scottish monarch wearing the crown is from the reign of Edgar, who was depicted in his great shield wearing the crown and holding a scepter and a sword. The first written reference to the crown of Scotland dates from the application of John Balliol in 1296. All right, that's 1296 is when Scottish independence come. All right, when the Scottish regality was described as consistent of a scepter, sword, crown, and ring. The crown and other regalia was seized by the army of Edward I of England in 1296 and taken back where? To England. All right? Taken back to England. So it's our property. If you understand the Stone of Abbey, the Stone of Abbey goes back to the canon clergy who colonized or migrated into the Isles of Danes, and at the time of what we call the enforcement of Christianity on the Anglo-Saxons at the time of what we call the English Reformation in 597 by Pope Gregory I and Augustine of Canterbury. All right, yeah, all the Anglo-Saxons and Christianity converted. Anglo-Saxons and the British Isles converted to Christianity, which spread here because this territory here in what we call North America presently is actually part of what we call the King's domain. All right, the King's Rim. I got case law to validate. All right, so when you're dealing with Stone of Abbey, you're going back into the Stone of Scone, and the Stone of Scones goes back into Jacob's Stone, and Jacob's Stone goes back into the abstract story as told in the Bible, dealing with Jacob's dream, Jacob's ladder, in regards to the dream that Jacob had in regards to our promise of an estate and land that his father promised him. All right. And we know the abstract is not coming to fruition. All right. You got to see this mentally from autobiological memory. All right. Through your engram. All right. It has to be in your DNA. All right. What you're doing right now is your whole being is reasoning or resonating on the frequency in your DNA through what we call biological immortality. You don't see the frequency or the change taking place because your biological cellular is immortal. All right? It's immortal, but do you reading this, you're doing what they call a digital uploading. In this case, it'll be a mental uploading that's in turn tuning in your biological cellular information to bring the body up to a frequency where you can adjust or absorb this information to meet us and here in the 13th English Church as we did Frederick Douglass on the ether plane or what we call the astral plane. Because you know this back in the 18th century. And how did we here in the 21st century catch up to him? So if we was able to do it, the next question to ask yourself, did you catch up to that frequency on that astral plane? Because as above, so below. All right? Let's move on. Okay. So we know the crown of Scotland was seized by Edward I when the Scots got their independence in 1295, and we know that the Jews were expelled. Those same Jews who claim to be the children of Israel, or those Hebrews who associate themselves with British Israelism. All right, those who are affiliated with the Scottish kings are those who are associated with British Israelism, which claim to be descendants of those of Abraham. All right. And all those who claim to be descendants of Abraham from an abstract story, you better stand in line with your claim. All right? Even though their claim was abstract from the Bible, they were living out their story in concrete because they was in control of the land. All right? Even not being heirs, they were in control of the land of an assumed birthright that they claim they own under what they call acquisition of sovereignty through prescription of sovereignty, which denotes to what we call prescription of easement and something that you do not own. which is a non-possessory right known as fee simple contrast to entail, because we know all entail is crown land, and crown land is personified by the crown, and we know the crown takes all land when all land is seized as a result of interstate. What? There be no heirs. We're going to see it in Justice Johnson versus McIntyre, our discovery case. Yes, indeed, we're going to see it. Let's get on. So let's look at St. Edward's crown. Thank you, Archbishop, for being moderator, my man. I appreciate you. All right. Everybody pull that up. Give me a second. All right. St. Edward's chair. St. Edward's chair, or St. Edward's crown, is the centerpiece of the crown jewels of the United Kingdom, the one you see now on Charles II's head. Those crown jewels belong to the crown jewels of England, because it's denotes to St. Edward the Confessor. St. Edward the Confessor is the grandson of our Jesus Christ. All right? He's the grandson of our reincarnation of Jesus Christ, who I'm the reincarnation of. So that's how I know this. St. Edward's crown is the centerpiece of the crown jewels of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is coming around to 1807? All right. Union of the Crown, Act of the Union to 1707. Yeah, Union of the Crown to 1803, somewhere around there. So it says named after St. Edward the Confessor. Versions of it have traditionally been used to crown English and British monarchs at their coronation since the 13th century. Everybody hear that? Now, he's a Scottish king. A German king got the story from a Scottish king who got his story from a person who's not even supposed to be king. All right, he usurped the throne by right of conquest, i.e., Henry VII. All right. Edward the Confessor wore his crown at Easter, Whitsun, and Christmas. In 1161, he was canonized, and objects connected with his reign became homely relics. The monk at his burial place, Westminster Abbey, claimed that Edward had asked them to look over his regalia in perpetuity for the coronation of all future English kings. Did you hear that? All future English kings. A crown referred to as St. Edward's crown is the first recorded as having been used for the coronation of Henry III. All right, in 1220. All right, who was Henry III? Henry III, the son of John. You hear that right there? These are facts. How we know? These are ancestors. They sitting in the mothership right here. All right, look at them sitting on the throne. All right, and the stars behind them. You don't see no land. You don't see no buildings. You don't see no birds flying. These are ancestors who are going on before you, who are waiting for you to be able to speed your frequency up so they can come back for you. All right? Yes. So Scotty can beam you up, can transport you, because the Scottish are the ones who keep this history sacred and hidden. All right? Yes, Henry III, son of John, John, son of Henry II, Henry II, son of Godfrey, the fifth kind of grand Jew. All right? Now, why do I say that? Let's bring this home. We talk about manifest destiny. We talk about acquisition of sovereignty. Acquisition of sovereignty, before we move to the case law, is when a state claims to be sovereign and takes over territory. That's called acquisition of sovereignty. And this is done by 5 different ways: accession, secession, conquest, effective occupation, and prescription. All right? And prescription. We should all know what these mean by now, but these can't happen until right of discovery is done, right of conquest is done, because acquisition of sovereignty result from right of discovery after right of conquest is done, which we know is done by force. Right of conquest. This is the same thing Henry VIII did by right of conquest. All right, which is acquisition of sovereignty, which is a form of prescription of sovereignty, which is right here. Prescription in international law is a sovereign transfer of a territory by the open encroachment by the new sovereign upon the territory for a prolonged period of time, acting as a sovereign without protest or contest by the other original sovereigns, and analogous to the common doctrine of easement by prescription for real property. And though easement is a non-possessory use and property that you do not own, you can enter it without possession. All right. And this is the situation we all find ourselves. This is a situation that Frederick Douglass found himself. This is a situation that Dred Scott found himself. This is a situation that all those who are migrating here or immigrating here in this present day by boatload, you're going to find yourself in the same situation as a result of your status as being a migrating slave sanctioned under Section 9 or Article 1 and regulated by Article 4, Clause 3. All right? We know that in 1808, international slave regulation, international slave trade was abolished, but it didn't say nothing about domestic slave trade. It didn't say nothing about domestic slave trade. All right? Let's look at that. How many of y'all teachers teach like this? The internal slave trade in the United States, also known as the domestic slave trade, the second Middle Passage in the interregional slave trade, was the mercantile trade of the enslaved people within the United States. Now, we ain't talking about the foreign trade, international trade, or the transatlantic slave trade, because that was abolished in 1808. All right? All right? It was abolished. All right? Now, the domestic trade, because we know that in Dred Scott case, it says that slavery was emphatically a part of the United States. It was incorporated in colonies because it was brought by Great Britain, and Great Britain is the Kingdom of Great Britain by way of the Act of Union of 1707. So all those who constitute Great Britain were slave traders, and the Negro black colored Ethiopians were the product or the chattel, i.e. the slaves, until we came to that understanding that Frederick Douglass did at the time of him dealing with them, his emancipation from slavery as a result of the slave regulations put in place by Section 3 of Article 4, all right, that governed domestic slave trade, all right? It governs domestic slave trade because what we have here, Act prohibiting international slave trade, but it's ain't about domestic. The Act of Importation of Slaves. The legislation was prompted by Thomas Jefferson, who called for the enactment in the 1806 State of the Union Address. He and others had promoted the idea since 1770 and reflected the force of the general trend towards abolishing the international slave trade, which Virginia, followed by all other states, have prohibited or restricted since then. All right. So it was the gradual abolition of the international slave trade, but they do nothing about the domestic slave trade. All right. The domestic slave trade with the United States was not affected by the 1807 law. With the legal supply of imported slaves terminated, the domestic slave trade increased and imported in addition, and some smuggling slaves persisted. All right. This is why Frederick Douglass is very important in understanding our position. All right. Understanding our position in here on this chessboard. All right. Because the chessboard is the allodial kingdom or the allodial rim. All right. The boxes on the chessboard or the allodial rim represents feudal tenure. All right. It can either be fee simple or it can be intel. All right. If it's intel, then that means that you ain't got no other player on the opposite side of the board. If it's intel. If it's not intel, then that means that the other players on top of the board, and that goes into what we call right of conquest, because that's a war going on. All right? An internal war on land. All right? And who's going to rule on that land? Who's going to govern that land? All right? And the people on that land is at the mercy of the result of the war. All right? And who fights the wars? Who fights the war? Is the people who are the pawns, and it's the knights who protect the kingdom and the people. All right? All right? They are all within the kingdom or the rim of the kingdom, protected by the king, under the authority of the king and what? His council. Who gives the king's counsel? The bishop. The bishop is the advisement. That represents a sanction between or fusion of power of church and state, right? And we know that the bishop advises the king and queen, who lives in what we call the castle, because we know one of the players on the board of chessboard is the crown. I didn't even know that, but that made it even more significant. All right. So we got the crown, we got the king, we got the queen, we got the bishop, we got the rook, we got the bishop, we got the pawn. Now we got to understand that you got to choose a side. And majority of chessboards you got, you either got black or white, or light brown and dark brown. All right. All right. We understand that Section 9 of Article 1 protects estate involvement in the elected slave trade until 1808. For 20 years, for the federal prohibited, Article 5 said that this clause could not be affected by a constitutional amendment. So I mean that international trade was abolished, but domestic trade was not. All right. And this is the reason why dealing with the authority that was incorporated inside the colonies, i.e. the 13 colonies, as established by the Dred Scott case, was a result of us not knowing who we are as a people. All right. This is what Frederick Douglass was trying to tell you. Without further ado, let's get it back into this case law. All right. Dred Scott case, I'm just going to be hitting and missing, is apparently a fact that states, without referring to presidents abroad or to colonial history for similar instances, the history of the Confederation and Union afford evidence to attest to the existence of the ancient law of what? Returning a slave back to his bondsman. All right? Returning a slave back to his bondsman. It's been a practice that's been regulated and accepted in the colony. All right? And no overseas presidents need to be called upon, nor no what they say, no, what it said, no, where is that? It says, without referring to any prejudice abroad or into any colonial history for similar instances, the history of the Confederation and the Union affords evidence to attest to the existence of the ancient law of returning a slave back to his bondsman. Why? Because we see it in Section 9 of Article 4. All right? Section 9 of Article 4, because it was regulated by Section 9 of Article 1. In the clause in the federal constitution providing for the restoration of physical slaves is a recognition of this ancient right and of the principles that a change of place does not affect a change of conditions. So because you move from one place to another, the conditions don't change. All right? You under the status of your mother. All right? Understand what's going on. This is the Dred Scott case. This is precedents. All right, they don't even need this, but yet we're referring to presidents. Why? Because they know with this presidents, as understanding your Anglo-Saxon history, it could be detrimental to them in regards to who you are on this land, how they deemed you to be a slave on this land, in regard of you not knowing your birthright. All right, and your birthright goes back to it being stolen from you at the time of William the Conqueror invaded England. All right, if Frederick Douglass knew that, how come we don't? Chief Justice Taney knew that. How come we don't? All right? Come on. Seriously, we got to ask these questions. The ordinance of William the Conqueror that a resident of any of the several populations of England for a year and a day without being claimed in a city, borough, wallet, town, or castle of the king should entitle them to the perpetuity of liberty is a specimen of these laws. So we understand that as a bondsman, whether your bondsman was a good man or a bad master, that's I mean, that's the chance you got to take, all right? We see the condition that Frederick Douglass was in, but yeah, he had the best of both worlds. He had bad masters and good masters, and he took the advantage of them both, all right? The power of the master over his slave has been extremely different in different countries. The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reason, moral or political, but only by positive law, which preserves its force long after the reason, occasion, and time itself, from which it was created, are erased from the memory. It is so obvious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. And we know that United States statutes are created by positive law. We went through that through my last lecture. We showed you that the United States Act was created by positive law. We know that the slave trade, as well as the Act prohibiting the importation of slaves, was created by statutory law, which is called positive law. It was created by statute, and you can be done away by statute, because that's where your life depends upon. A statute, take a regular statute, a sculptor statue. It's not alive. It's not real. It's created by a live person for a colored person. Now, somebody's playing God, because law is supposed to be created for human beings, not corporations. And corporations don't exist. So how can something that don't exist make a law for something that don't exist? That don't make no sense. So if somebody made a law for something that don't exist, the only person that can do that is something that exists. All right? And that means that that person's paying God and hiding that godness from the individual that he created. All right? Go back to what we call the Wizard of Oz. All right? Let's move forward. All right. 379 is a settled doctrine. It's a settled doctrine of this court that the federal government can exercise no power over the subject of slavery within the state, nor control the intermigration of slaves other than fugitives among the states, nor can the government affect the duration of slavery within the state other than by legislation over the foreign slave trade, which we know ended in 1808, which still allowed domestic slavery. All right, and we know slavery under this case is migration or intermigration. All right, so now they went back on the 1808 because now they're allowing intermigration and migration of slave. Hell, the New York governor just said, open up your home to the migrants. All right? Why? Because you're no different than the migrants. You're all slaves. All right? Under forced acquisition of sovereignty. All right? And look what happened in that forced sovereignty. All right? You have no rights now. You're being forced to migrate. All right? Because we know slavery is migration. They can tell you where to go, when to go, why they want you to go, for whatever reason they want you to go. All right? Why? Because it's sanctioned. The third section of the fourth article of the Constitution is referred to the all and only sufficient grant. All right? We know when you're a grant, you're dealing with a letter patent. We deal with letter patent, you're dealing with permission, the authority from a grant to a grantee. All right, in regards to whatever the property is. In this case, it's dealing with personal property. All right? The situation, the acquisition, the conveyance, the transferring of personal chattel property. All right? Sanctioned by the third section of the fourth article of the Constitution, which is presently being used today. It is that the new state may be admitted by Congress, i.e. secession, which is known acquiescence of sovereignty, which is a form of conquest, all right, which is a form of prescription, which is a form of an open encroachment for a long period of time, because they've been operating for a long time now, all right, for on property that they do not own or possess. That's called a non-prescription of easement, all right? Let's move forward. New states may be admitted by Congress to the Union, but no state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other states, nor any state be formed by the junction of two or more states or part of state without the consent of the legislature of the state concerned, as well as of that of Congress. Congress has the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other properties belonging to the United States, and nothing in this Constitution should be so construed as to purchase any claim of the United States or any other particular state. All right? This is a Dred Scott case we're reading right now. All right? And we're dealing with slavery, the regulation of slavery, and where slavery can be regulated. All right? But it can't be regulated on Crown land, right? Because Crown land is part of what we call the public trust doctrine, as Martin versus Waddell states, which we'll get to in a second. All right, as confirmed in this case, pursuant to the Johnson versus McIntyre case, which deal with the right of discovery. Whatever you discover, it can't be that which already belonged to somebody. All right. So it says, by the recognition of the plenary power of Congress to dispose of the public domain, and public domain, you're saying public trust, and public trust is Martin versus Waddell, or to organize the government over it, does not imply a corresponding authority to determine the internal polity, because it's already in place, or to adjust the domestic relations or the persons who may lawfully inhabit the territory in which it is situated. There's a supreme power to make needful rules respecting the public domain, i.e. public trust doctrine, i.e. federal land, i.e. land you can't touch, and similar power of framing laws to operate upon the person and things within that territorial limits, where it lies is only distinguished by the demarcation line as dictated by American history, and American history is based upon how much you know about this land called America. All right, and we know if you don't know about Johnson versus McIntyre case, you don't know a darn thing about America. Why? Because it says in the Johnson versus McIntyre as preamble in Martin versus Waddell, where it deals with the public trust doctrine, and we know Johnson versus McIntyre deals with the right discovery doctrine, and we know the right of discovery didn't come about to the right of conquest, which is how we get into acquisition, succession, prescription, conquest, accession, or encroachment. They say, according to the theory of British Constitution, that all vacant lands are vested in the Crown. Did y'all hear me? And that the exclusive power to grant them is admitted to reside in the Crown as the branch of the royal prerogative. All land we hold were originally granted by the Crown, and the establishment of the royal government has never been considered to impairing that right to grant land within the charter limits of the colony. And the British Parliament did claim the supremacy of legislation, i.e. statute, coextensive with the absoluteness of the dominion of the acquisition sovereign over the crown land. They ain't the true sovereigns, they're only sovereign through acquisition. All right. The American doctrine to the contrary, by way of their acquisition of sovereign over government by way of open encroachment, easement, prescription, conquest, cession, they state here, according to those who made up the congressionals in Pennsylvania in 1774, they first stated that the inhabitants of those colonies, those settlers, those free white persons, those who were allowed to come over here by way of migration, i.e. slaves, are entitled to the same rights, this is the encroachment, y'all, and the liberties within the colonies that the subjects, i.e. now called slaves, i.e. the Anglo-Saxon Berbers, which Frederick Douglass identified, born now here in North America, have the same rights here in this realm now called America as we did in England, but they have been stolen by way of the colonies, right? Because now the colonies got you enslaved by way of slavery under Section 3, Article 4, and regulated by legislation, Section 9, or Article 1 of the Constitution. All right? That the power assumed by Parliament to bind the people of these colonies by statutes in all cases whatsoever is unconstitutional, but they're doing it though. How could it be unconstitutional, but you're doing the very same thing that you said you couldn't do? All right? Is their statement of rights and grievances affirmed in a free and exclusive power of legislation? And then there are several provincial legislators in all cases of taxation and internal policy subject only to the negative of their sovereign in such manner as has been heretofore used in the custom. All right? You must understand. The unanimous consent of the people of the colonies then to the power of their sovereign to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory of the crown in 1774 was deemed by them an entirely consistent with opposition, remonstrance, the renunciation of allegiance, and the proclamation of civil war in preference to the submission to his claim of supreme power and territory. I know y'all like how that sounds. All right. Now I pass to the evidence. During the Revolution and the Confederation, all right, the American Revolution was not a social revolution. It did not alter the domestic conditions or the capacity of persons within the colonies. All right. It didn't alter your status, your condition, your servitude, your serfness, as Frederick Douglass said. It says the American Revolution was not a social revolution. It did not alter the domestic condition or the capacity of persons within the colonies, nor was it deemed to disturb the domestic relations existing amongst them. It was a political revolution by which the 13 independent colonies became 13 independent states, fraudulently declaring their independences. Fraudulently declaring of independence was not, says Justice Chase, a direct declaration that the United Colonies jointly and collectively collective capacities for independent states, etc., 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 but that each of them was a sovereign, i.e., acquisition of sovereignty by claiming land that you don't own, and now claim to be independent states. That is, that each of them had a right to govern itself by its own authority and its own law without any control from another power on earth. This is called police powers, y'all. police powers, eminent domain. All right. These sovereigns and independent states being united as a confederation by various public acts of cession, acquisition of sovereignty, became jointly interested in territory and concerned to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting it. All right. So they became jointly interested in disposing of territory and making all needful rules and regulations and territory that they don't own. All right. They became interested in it. They didn't have an active interest in it. All right. They just had an interest in it. It is a conclusion now open to discussion of this court. I wonder why, that there was no territory within the original United States, i.e. the Articles of Confederation, i.e. the original 13 colonies, i.e. that they was claimed by them, and any other right than that of some of the Confederate states. All right. So for clarity on that, you must go to Johnson versus McIntyre. All right. The question whether the vacant lands within the United States, said Chief Justice Marshall, became joint property or belonging to separate states was a monumentous question which threatened to shake the American Confederacy to its foundation. This important and dangerous question has been compromised, and the compromise is not now to be contested. Why? Because they don't want to address slavery. They don't want to address slavery, y'all. All right? Why? Let's see why. If you're a Negro, Black, colored Ethiopian, you cannot use this argument being brought to you today. You see what Frederick Douglass is saying to them. You don't see what he said in his book, nor in the article I read, other than what was said in the narratives given by those who don't know a thing about Anglo-Saxon history, only that identity that was misnomered for us to take flight off. All right, to assume that that is our history. In fact, our history. Frederick Douglass didn't even concede to that approach. All right, he didn't even concede to that approach. Why? Let's see why not. Listen, y'all. Slavery is emphatically a state institution. In the ninth section, we already went through Section 3, Article 4, which allows the regulation of slavery domestically, all right, but ban international regulation of slave trade, but not domestically, all right? And we know they didn't ban it because migration is still going on, all right? Migrants are still coming in around the clock. Slavery is effectively a state institution. In the ninth section of the first article of the Constitution, it provided that the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing should think proper to admit should not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. All right, 1808 it was not no longer permitted on an international level, but domestically it was. All right, and the convention was proposed by the Committee of 11 to limit the importation of slaves to the year 1808, when Mr. Pinckney moved to extend the time to the year 1808. This motion was carried New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, voting in the affirmative, and New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Virginia in the negative. In opposition to the motion, Mr. Madison said 20 years will produce all the mischief that can be apprehended from the liberty to import slaves, so long as a term will be more dishonorable to an American character than to say nothing about it in our Constitution. The provisions in regard to the slave trade shows clearly that Congress' intentions consider slavery a state institution to be continued and regulated not on the international level but at the domestic level by its individual sovereign states, and to facilitate that interest, the slave trade was continued 20 years, not as a general measure, but for the benefit of such states as shall think proper to encourage it. Okay? There you have it. All right? There you have it. Let's read this last thing. We need not to refer to the mercenary spirits which introduced the infamous traffic in slaves to show the degradation of Negro slavery in our country. The system was imposed upon our colonial settlements by the mother country, and is due to truth to say that the commercial colonies and the states were chiefly engaged in the traffic. But we know as historical fact that James Madison, that great and good man, a leading member in the Federal Convention, was solicitous to guard the language of that instrument so as not to convey the idea that there could be property in man. All right? So we said it was emphatically a part of the United States, as well as we want to see this as well. To the position that slavery can only exist except under the authority of law, it is objected that in a few, if in any instance, has it been established by a statutory enactment, i.e. positive law, there is no answer to the doctrine laid down by the court. Almost all the principles of the common law had their foundation and uses. Slavery was introduced into the colonies of this country by Great Britain at the early period of their history, and it was protected and cherished until it became incorporated into the colonial policy. It is immaterial whether a system of slavery was introduced by express law or otherwise. It has the authority of law. Okay, there you see it. Let's come to a closing on the Dred Scott case, and let's move to the let's deal with the public trust doctrine. Slavery state was at 1%. Many of the states on the adoption of the Constitution shortly afterward took measures to abolish slavery within their respective jurisdictions. And it is a well-known fact that the belief was cherished by the leading men, South as well as North, that the institution of slavery would gradually decline until they would become extinct. All right? The increased value of slave labor and the culture of cotton and sugar prevented the realization of this expectation. So they knew it was supposed to have been extinct or become extinct by a gradual effect, but their main concern was cotton, sugar, coal. All right, that's their main concern, making money. That's their main concern now, making money. All right, they took the slavery off the chain and put it now by way of contract, because contract makes law based off ignorance. But if we turn our attention to the dark ages of the world, why confine our view to the cut of slavery, i.e., on the same principle, white men were made slaves. All slavery has its origin in the power and is against rights. So no matter how or what form it come under, it is against the rights of men. All right? It is against the rights of men. All right? So you must understand the focal point of what Frederick Douglass was trying to get us to see in regards to understanding territories that belong to the crown in territory that was ceded to those who claimed sovereignty on the acquisition of power through prescriptions of sovereignty when the crown was usurped by those who claimed to be de facto kings of the crown. All right? Right? Do what we call the right of discovery, which goes back to Henry VIII, due to what we call the right of conquest. All right? The right of conquest. Let's go to Martin versus Waddell. I'm gonna hit this real quick, and then we're gonna move to the last one, Johnson versus McIntyre. Martin versus Waddell. All right. Public trust doctrine. Sure. I thought I had it. The public trust doctrine is the principle that a sovereign holds its trust for the public use some resources such as shoreline between the high and low tide, regardless of private property of ownership. So that means it's subject to reversion and remandment in lieu of acquiring the title for one of an owner. All right. Acquiring the title of one of the owners, that's called a lis pendens. All right. Tracing the chain of title back to the original grantor, and we know that is the crown. All right. That is the crown. In England, the principle became the law in England as well, since it later Magna Carta further strengthened the public right at the insistence of the English nobles. Fishing weirs which obstructed free navigation were to be removed from the river. Blase, blase. In the United States, the rights were further strengthened by later laws in England and subsequently became part of the common law of the United States. The Supreme Court first accepted the public trust doctrine in Martin versus Waddell. Let's go to Martin versus Waddell. We're hitting the moving. The land in controversy is within the boundaries of the charter and the territory which is now formed the state of New Jersey. The territory and the grant by succeeding conveyances became vested in the proprietors of East Jersey, who conveyed the premises in controversy to the defendant in error. The properties by the terms of the grant to them were originally invested with all the rights of government and property which were conferred on Duke of York. Afterward, in 1702, the proprietors surrendered to the crown all the powers of the government retaining the rights of private property. All right. So we know that the crown took the land, and we know that in the Dred Scott case that the colonies had to make rules and regulations in lieu of disposition of the land, respecting those that land belonging to the crown. All right, because it was part of the public trust. All right, part of the public trust. The public trust can be limited if you don't know where the origin of the public trust originated from. All right, because those who claim hold of the public trust is only doing by way of what we call prescription. All right, and they're doing by way of prescription, and that means it falls into what they call bona vacantinia, abandoned property. It don't belong to them who claim to own it. All right. They're just using it for the meantime. All right. The right of the King of Great Britain to make this grant to Duke of York with all its prerogatives and powers of government cannot at this day be questioned. The English possession in America was not claimed by right of conquest or right of discovery. Did y'all hear that? It wasn't claimed by right of conquest or right of discovery. So that means you got to go back to Henry VIII, because Henry VIII conquered the lands that were controlled by England, and then sent people over here in lieu of what we call right of discovery to claim lands in lieu of those who were already here, who were already descendants of those who were descendants of England. All right? You got to know the history of Spain and France for you to make that connection, because Edward I had jurisdiction over here, and he was of the Plantagenet crown. All right? Because he's in statute. So any person who descends from his lineage is an heir. All right? And that makes the land entail, inheritable, right? It's inheritable. But if there are no English heirs, then it automatically goes in what they call estates, because all the heirs die interstate. And this is the case as stated in Discovery Doctrine under Johnson versus McIntosh, which is the case we'll close on. All right? According to the principles of international law, as then understood by the civilized power of Europe, the Indian tribes in the New World were regarded as mere temporary occupants of the soil, and that the absolute right of property and dominion were held to belong to the European nation by which any portion of the country was first discovered. So they don't care about the intel aspect of it. They're just dealing with it from the discovery aspect of it, because they know it resulted from conquest, acquisition of sovereignty, you know what I'm saying, which is conquest. And when you conquest, then that gives room for cession, and cession gives room for prescription. All right? We have to understand that, you know what I'm saying? But you won't understand that if you're not an English, all right? Because it was the English that was conquered, going back to Henry VIII, by somebody of our own house, all right? Of our own house, all right? And he the one came up with what we call right of conquest, where the origin of what we use today stems from. We started what we call the right of discovery, all right? The country granted by King Charles II, Duke of York, was held by the king in his public and regal character, corporation so, as a representative of the nation and a trust for them, all right? Says to pay fiefmen, land tenure. Discoveries made by persons acting under the authority of the government were for the benefit of the nation, not private property. And the crown, according to the principles of the British Constitution, was the proper organ to dispose of the public domain. And they quoting who? Johnson versus McIntosh. All right? That deals with right of discovery. We're talking about the public trust doctrine. All right? In regards to protecting and respecting and making needful rules and regulations in regards to the disposition of land, which is basically off statute of disposition in regards to those heirs. Operation of law, y'all, transferred by what we call operation of law. The dominion and property and navigable waters and lands under them being held by the king as a public trust, the grant to an individual of any exclusive fishery in any portion of it is so much taken from the common fund entrusted to his care for the common benefit. In such cases, whatever does not pass by grant remains in the crown for the benefit and the advantage of the whole community. Grants of that description are therefore construed strictly, and it will not be presumed that the king intended to part from any portion of the public domain unless clear and special words are used to denote to it. All right? The question upon this charter are very different. It is not a deed conveying private property to be interpreted by the rules applicable to the case of that description. It was an instrument upon was to be founded the institution of a great political community, and in that light, it should be regarded and construed. So all the deeds that all the properties had was not for themselves for property. It was for the institution for a political or a policy or government set up for English subjects who are heirs by way of it being an entail estate called crown land, which is inseparable from the monarch who personifies it. All right? But we see how it got usurped by those under the Treaty of Perpetual Peace that was done by Henry VII and King James V of the House of Stuart, all right? Through the Union of Crowns, all right? And we know the Union of Crowns is how they got their authority, which is the usurpation of the authority of the crown, which is not their royal prerogative or jury legality. It's ours, all right? It's mine, all right? Let's see. The land under the navigable waters within the limits of the charter passed to the grantees as one of the royalties instances to the powers of the government, and were to be held by him in the same manner and for the same purpose that the navigable waters of England and the soils under them are held by the crown. The parts of England since the Magna Carta for the last 600 years has been carefully preserved to secure the common right of episcopacy for the benefit of the public domain. All right? It's been here, y'all. It's been protected. All right? Even under the authority of those de facto kings. All right? Even under their authority. All right? How we know it? Let's see. A lot of information in this case, y'all. Okay, right here. We're gonna close out on the public we call it public trust doctrine, and we're gonna go into the doctrine of discovery. All right. It says the opinion is confirmed by referring to similar grants for other tracts of country upon this continent, made about the same period of time. Various other charters for large territories on the Atlantic coast were granted by different minors of the Stuart dynasty to different persons for the purpose of settlement and colonization, in which the power of government were united with the grant of territory. Some of these charters were nearly resembled in every respect the one now in controversy, and none of them, it is believed, differ materially from it in the terms of which the bays, rivers, and arms of the sea and the soils under them were conveyed to the grantees. All right? We must understand that. All right? So let's move to the doctrine of discovery. Johnson versus McIntosh. All right. This is the doctrine of discovery. Everybody pull that up. Johnson versus McIntosh. Come right here. Point 11. Okay. You know, Dred Scott case deals with slavery, the regulation of slavery, the institution of slavery, the legislation, the laws that govern slavery, the regulation of slavery, as well as the succession of lands for slavery to be instituted on. It also shows you slavery being instituted going all the way back to the Norman conquest, in the ancient law going back to the Norman conquest is recognized by the colonists as well as Great Britain because that's where it was transferred from. All right. We read all of this in the Dred Scott case. And we know that as a result of that, territory had to be succeeded for this to take place. But in lieu of that ceded territory, just the disposition and rules and regulations in regards to that territory that was being made must respect that territory that belonged to the crown, which in total reality, it all belonged to the crown. It all belonged to the crown. This is what President Douglas was saying in regards to the Mexico and American War. All right. And lieu of this manifest destiny, because the only manifest destiny you had was the territory that was ceded to you, going back to the territory from the Treaty of Paris of 1763. But how can you cede that or claim that territory when it was already ceded back to Great Britain? How can you claim any interest in it when it was ceded back to the Kingdom of England? Because Great Britain stole it by enslaving those of England and taking over their parliamentary government. All right? We see that. It was stated by the Dred Scott case. And we know the Dred Scott case stated that once we woke up, that the preservation of this land and respecting the land in regards to that was protected by the public trust doctrine is regulated by Martin versus Waddell in lieu of the land that was discovered through the doctrine of discovery as established here in Johnson versus McIntosh, which we'll close out on. Johnson versus McIntosh. This case deals with a claim of Indian chiefs making claims to Aboriginal titles here on land here in North America, but the court said they lacked legal standing in regards to this because, as far as they understood it, the land remained in the crown. You hear that? The land remained in the crown. We know when we say in time immemorial, us as English Anglo-Saxon, time immemorial, go back to Richard I. When you're dealing with the Native Americans, it deals with land given by grants to Native American Indians, all right? But those grants given to Native American Indians going back to time immemorial, depending on those lands given to them by the king. This is what Johnson versus McIntosh said. So no matter what avenue, what road, what venue you attack this from, you're going to have to come this way. All right? You're going to have to come this way. It states here in point 11 that from time immemorial and always upon the present time, all the Indian tribes or nations of North America, and especially in Illinois and the Pickasaws and other tribes holding, possessing, and inhabiting the said countries north and northeast of Ohio, east of the Mississippi, and west of the Great Miami, held their respective lands and territories, each in common, the individuals of each tribe or nation holding the lands and territories of such tribe in common with each other, and there being among them no separate property in the soil, and that their sole method of selling, granting, and conveying the land, whether to government or individuals, always had been from time immemorial, and now is to certain chiefs of the tribes telling to represent the whole tribe in every part of that transaction to make the contract and execute the deed on behalf of the whole tribe to receive further consideration, whether in money or commodities or both, and finally to divide such consideration among the individuals of the tribe, and that the authority of the chief so acting for the whole tribe is attested by the presence and assent of the individuals composing the tribe, or some of them, and by the receipt by the individuals composing the tribe of the respective share of the price and in no other manner. So they're talking about having a dispute reviewed in a court of law in regards to their claim on an interest in land. All right? Decided by a government that has no right to even decide the interest on land because they themselves can't prove they even own it. All right? Because the land is allodial, but allodial, you have to trace it back to the chain of title, and the chain of title is the crown. All right? And they don't want to review that because they know the crown was here before the right of conquest came into the initiation, which brought forth what we call right of discovery, which brought forth acquisitions of sovereignty, which we call prescriptive sovereignty. All right? Let's see. Let's go to 471. So time immemorial, y'all. We're going to go to Chief Justice Marshall because Chief Justice Marshall made the decision in regards to the doctrine of discovery being the method for claiming ownership of real property here in North America, subject to reversion and remandment, because we know that the highest form of ownership in North America is fee simple, fee indefeasible, or life estate. And we know with them, they don't carry indefeasible titles because majority of the indefeasible titles are registered by the county, which has a warranty, i.e., title insurance. And title insurance is the secondary and is one form of deed of conveyance or conveyance of property, i.e., real estate, and the other form is called Torrance land title, which ultimately goes back to the original grantor, which is making sure that whatever form of instrument you claim to have and denote to ownership of property, it must denote to the original grantor. All right, and the original grantor, it must be a allodial because somebody must own the land, and when the land is owned, the land is held in allodial. Please see United States versus standard what's it? State versus Parson versus Standard Oil Company. Once again, Parson, Attorney General for the state versus Standard Oil Company. All right. So in closing, Mr. Chief Justice Marshall delivered the opinion of the court. The plaintiff in this cause claimed the land in their declaration mentioned under two grants purported to be made, first in 1733 and the last in 1755, by the chiefs of certain Indian tribes, constituting the Illinois and the Piankashaw Nation. And the question is whether the title can be recognized in the courts of the United States. All right. As the right of society to prescribe these rules by which property may be acquired and preserved, it is not and cannot be drawn into question, as the title to land especially is and must be admitted to depend entirely on the law of the nation in which they lie. It will be necessary in pursuing this inquiry to examine not singly those principles of abstract justice which the creator of all things had impressed on the minds of his creature men, and which are admitted to regulate in a great degree the rights of civilized nations, whose perfect independence and acknowledged, but those principles also which our own government has adopted in the particular case and given us as a rule for our decision. On the discovery of this immense continent, the great nations of Europe were eager to appropriate to themselves so much of it as they could receive respectfully acquired. Its vast extent offered an ample field to the ambition and enterprise of all, and the character and religion of its inhabitants afforded an apology for the conserving them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim ascendancy. The potentness, remember what Frederick Douglass said about the Anglo-Saxon as presently a dean. You know what I'm saying? They're living off a history that don't belong to them, claiming the descent from an ascendancy that they never ascended from. All right? This is in the same breath. Read that under the same texture. All right? The potentates of the old world found no difficulty in convincing themselves that they made ample compensation to the inhabitants of the new by bestowing on them civilization and Christianity in exchange for unlimited independence. But as they were all in pursuit of nearly the same object, it was necessary in order to avoid conflict and settlements and consequent war with each other to establish a principle which all should acknowledge as the law by which the right of acquisition, which they all asserted, should be regulated as between themselves. So as we see in the right of discovery is by way of right of acquisition, all right? Which is conquest, secession, prescription, accretion, open encroachment, and whatever means they see deem fit, which they all asserted should be regulated as between themselves. This principle was that discovery gave title to the government by whose subjects or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, which title might be consummated by possession. All right? You must understand what's going on. Let's see where I want to go. The establishment of these relations, the right of the original inhabitants, were in no instance entirely disregarded, but were necessary to a considerable extent impaired. They were admitted to be the rightful occupants of the soil, with a legal as well as a just claim to retain possession of it, and to use it according to their own discretion by their rights to complete the sovereignty as an independent nation were necessarily diminished in their power. To dispose of the soil at their own will to whomever they please was denied by the original fundamental principle that discovery gave exclusive title to those who made it. All right. Remember the Dred Scott case we just read. It's very important because it's going to show you the distinction between the point I'm trying to make. All right. While the different nations of Europe respected the rights of natives as occupants, they asserted the ultimate dominion to be in themselves, and claimed and exercised as a consequence of this ultimate dominion a power to grant the soil while yet in possession of the natives. You hear that? These grants have been understood by all to convey a title to the grantees, subject only to the Indian rights of occupancy. The history of America from its discovery to the present day proves, we think, the universal recognition of these principles. Spain did not rest her title solely on the grant of the Pope. You hear that? We know Pope took all the land by the conversion of the Anglo-Saxon in 597. All right. So it says Spain did not rest her title solely on the grant of the Pope. Her discussions respective boundaries with France, with Great Britain, and with the United States all show that she placed it on the right given by discovery. Okay? They all placed it on the right of discovery. Their first object was commercial, as appears by the grant made by a company of merchants in 1614, but in 1621, the States General made, as were told by Mr. Smith, a grant of the country to the West India Company by the name of New Netherland. The claim of the Dutch was always contested by the English, not because they questioned the title given by discovery, but because they insisted on being themselves the rightful claimants under the title. So the right of discovery was being contested by the English because those who made a claim on the land were not English. They were claimed to be descendants of the English by way of usurping the English ascendancy. All right? This is what Frederick Douglass was trying to tell you. This is what I'm trying to tell you. This is what the kings of Wessex and the plantations of the crown who ruled Normandy was trying to tell you. All right? The claim of the Dutch was always contested by the English, not because they questioned the title given by discovery, but because they insisted on being themselves the rightful claimant under the title. In order for you to prove that, you got to prove the chain of title. All right? You have to prove the chain of title. No one of the powers of Europe gave a full assent to these principles more unequivocally than England. The documents upon this subject are ample and complete. So early as the year 1496, Her Minos granted a commission to John Cabot to discover countries then unknown to Christian people. So that means that when John Cabot went on the right of discovery for Henry VIII, who conquered through right of conquest the Lancaster branch of the Cadet branch of the Plantagenet crown, Christianity was nowhere around on the British Isles or in North America. All right? Because it said John Cabot went on discovery here. It says Minos granted commission to Cabot to discover the countries then unknown to Christian people and to take possession of them in the name of the King of England. You hear that? Not the King of Scotland, not the King of Ireland, not the King of Germany, not the King of Denmark, not the King of Netherlands, none of them. All right? In the first effort made by English government to acquire territories on this continent, we perceive a complete recognition of the principles which have been mentioned. The right of discovery given by this commission is confined to countries then unknown to all Christian people. And of these countries, Cabot was empowered to take possession in the name of the King of England. We clarified for you twice. All right? We need clarification for who this land belongs to. All right? Very important. In 1609, after some expensive and not very successful attempts at settlement had been made, a new and more enlarged charter was given by the crown to the first colony, in which the king granted to the treasury and company of adventures of the city of London for the first colony in Virginia. In absolute property, the lands extended along the seacoast for hundreds of miles and to the land throughout from sea to sea. All right. This charter, which is part of the special verdict in this case, was annulled so far as respect to the rights of the company by the judgment of the court of the king's bench on a writ of quo warranto, but the whole, see Billings versus Harris, but the whole effect allowed this judgment was to revest in the crown the power of the government and the title to land within its limits. All right? You can't separate it from the crown. It's entail. The king personifies the crown. Thus, has our whole country been granted by the crown while in the occupation of the Indians? These grants purport to convey the soil as well as the rights of dominion to the grantees. In those governments which were dominated royal, where the rights to the soil was not vested in individuals, but remained in the crown, or was vested in the colonial government, the king claimed and exercised the right of granting land and of dismembering the government at his will. The grants made out of the two original colonies after resumption of the charter by the crown are examples of this. The government of New England, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and a part of the Carolina were thus created, and all of them, the soil at the time the grant was made was occupied by the Indians. Yet almost every title within those governments by the Indians and depended on these grants. In some instances, the soil was conveyed by the crown, unoccupied by the power of the government, as in the case of the northern neck of Virginia. It has never been objected to this or to any other similar grant that the title as well as their possession was in the Indian which it was made, and that it possessed nothing on that account. Once again, I repeat. As in the case of, it has never been objected to this or to any other similar grant that the title as well as possession was the Indians when it was made, and that it passed nothing on the account. Okay. Thus, all nations of Europe who have acquired territory on this continent have asserted in themselves and have recognized in others this exclusive right of the discoverers to appropriate the lands occupied by the Indians. Have the American states rejected or adopted this principle? By the treaty which concluded the war of our revolution, Great Britain relinquished all claims not only to the government, but to the property and territorial rights of the United States, whose boundaries are fixed in the second article. All right? By this treaty, the power of government and the right to soil, which had previously been in Great Britain, passed definitely to these states. Acquisition of sovereignty, not true sovereignty, all right? To these states. We had before taken possession of them by declaring independence, but neither the Declaration of Independence nor the treaty confirming it could give us more than that which was before possessed or to which Great Britain was before entitled. Did you hear that? It has never been doubted that either the United States or the several states had a clear title in all the lands within the boundaries, and all the lands within the boundaries, boundary lines described in the treaty, subject only to the Indian rights of occupancy, that the exclusive power to extinguish that right was vested in the government which might constitutionally exercise it. Coming to my closing. Our late acquisition from Spain are the same character, and the negotiation which preceded those acquisitions recognize and elucidate the principle which has been received as the foundation of all European titles in America. The United States then has United States then has unequivocally acceded to that great and broad rule by which its civilized inhabitants now hold this country. They hold and assert in themselves the title by which it was acquired. They maintain, as all others have maintained, that discovery gave an exclusive right to extinguish the Indian title of occupancy either by purchase or by conquest, and gave also a right to such a degree of sovereignty as the circumstances of people would allow them to exercise. The power now possessed by the government of the United States to grant lands residing while we were colonies in the crown or in grantees, parceled. The power now possessed by the government of the United States to grant land reside while we were colonies in the crown or as grantees. The validity of the title given by either being questioned in our courts. Parceled. Let me read that one again. The power is now possessed by the government of the United States to grant lands resided while we were colonies in the crown or in grantees. The validities of the titles given by either been questioned in our courts. It has been exercised uniformly over territories and possessions of the Indians. The existence of this power must negate the existence of any rights which may conflict with and control it. An absolute title to lands cannot exist at the same time different persons or in different governments. An absolute title must be an exclusive title, or at least a title which excludes all others not compatible with it. All other institutions recognize the absolute title of the crown, subject only to the Indian rights of occupancy, and recognize the absolute title of the crown to extinguish that right. This incompatible with an absolute and complete title to Indians. We will not enter into the controversy whether the agriculturists, merchants, and manufacturers have a right on abstract principles to expel hunters from the territory they possess or to contract their limits. Conquest gives a title which the courts of the conqueror cannot deny. Whatever the private and speculative opinion of individuals may be respecting the original justice of the claim which has been successfully asserted, the British government, which was then our government and whose right had passed to the United States, asserted title to all the lands occupied by the Indian within the charter limits of the British colony. It asserted also a limited sovereignty over them and the exclusive rights of extinguishing the title which occupancy gave to them. These claims have been maintained and established as far west as the river of Mississippi by sword. All right. In closing, the soil to which the crown originally claimed title, being no longer occupied by its ancient inhabitants, was parceled out according to the will of the sovereign power and taken possession of by persons who claim immediately from the crown or immediately through its grantees or deputies. I repeat, the soil to which the crown originally claimed title, being no longer occupied by its ancient inhabitants, was parceled out according to the will of the sovereign power and taken possession of by persons who claim immediately from the crown or immediately through its grantees or deputies by acquisition of sovereignty to prescription of sovereignty by way of prescription of easement of a non-possessory use and property that you do not own. After stating that this controversy between the several states and the United States has been compromised, the court thought it necessary to notice the Indian title, which although entitled to the respect of all courts until it should be legitimately extinguished, was declared not to be such as to be absolutely repugnant to the possession and fee on the part of the state. So it has been compromised. And back to Dred Scott. The sovereign and independent states, being united as a confederacy by various public acts of cession, became jointly interested in territory conceded to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting it, It is a conclusion now open to discussion in this court that there was no territory within the original United States that was claimed by them in any other right than that of some of the Confederate states. The question whether the vacant lands within the United States, says Chief Judge Marshall, one who dealt with the doctrine of discovery, became joint property or relating to the separate states, was a monumental question which threatened to shake the American Confederacy to its foundation. This important and dangerous question has been compromised, and the compromise is not now to be contested. So there you have it. You see that the compromise is now being contested by the Anglo-Saxons, who have the proper claim as a result of them coming under the proper apparatus. All right, we are able to elevate our trajectory in lieu of our flight to the freedom that Frederick Douglass so eloquently spoke of to all those who were claiming to be descendants of England when he went to speak as an orator in England and Ireland on the British Isles. And he told them in the opening PDF I read that they should no longer consider themselves associated with that ancient race and the origin of that ancient race known as the Anglo-Saxon Berbers, who now are misnomered as Negro, Black, Colored, and Ethiopian. So with that, I end this lecture. I hope that you realize that I repeatedly and then repetitively going to continue with this, because you must see yourself through the eyes of Frederick Douglass, because Frederick Douglass saw himself through the eyes of the Third Temple English Church. Even though the church wasn't there, he still seen that through his mental remembrance, through autobiological memory, through autoscopy, which is modern day daydreaming. As you can see, we are all in, because we all are dreaming about the day when we can finally become free. And with that, we say peace.